Good evening. I'm Fred Passman, and I welcome you to the February 2023 installment of the Continental Commandery Naval Order of the United States Virtual Military History Program. Tonight, before I talk about tonight's special guest speaker, just want to remind those who may not know that the Naval Order's mission is to preserve, promote, and celebrate and enjoy our nation's sea service history. And when I say sea service, as you may have gathered from the opening scene, it includes the Marine Corps, the Navy, the Coast Guard, the Merchant Marine, and U.S. Public Health Service, and last, certainly not least, NOAA. Just a little bit of housekeeping. During our presentation, I invite you to enter question and answer into the comments section on your screen. So those of you who are watching via live stream can ask questions. And after our speaker has finished the formal part of the presentation, we will share your questions and give her a chance to answer them. With that, I would like to welcome Ms. Cinzi Lavin. Cinzi's full biography is available on her website, which Mark is going to stream below in just a second, so that you can go. Lots of good material on that site. Welcome, Cinzi. One question I have about your site. I tried clicking on some of your stream programs, and there are no hyperlinks.
Oh, goodness. Well, actually, the website updated today, so it's a little bit different format now, but eventually I'm going to build some more things into it. So if people can't reach things now, they should be able to sometime in the near future.
Great. So I clicked on several of your programs that looked particularly interesting, and much to my chagrin, nothing happened.
Oh, no.
Okay, so that's a no, by the way. I get that on my website occasionally. Wait, you got this link, and it's a dead link. All right, so Cinzi, you started life in New York and migrated down to Houston or to Texas, where you did most of your growing up.
Yep.
What were you? Did you say what you were 10 or 12 when you?
A little bit older than that. I was actually about 15, I think.
15. Oh, okay, so you spent your adolescence.
Yes.
Now, that must have been a strong cultural shift for you.
It very much was. It was especially considering the town that I moved to from. I've been living in Scarsdale. I've been born in Manhattan and raised in Scarsdale, and then the town that we moved to is in the Texas Hill Country, Fredericksburg, Texas, home of Admiral Nimitz, I might add. And the town is very, very small. We used to joke there's only one street light in town. You know, when you plug in a blow dryer, the town street light dims, that kind of thing. So,
just like Manhattan.
Yes. But it gave me an appreciation for different cultures, different social systems. It was a really good experience overall, and it's a very, very wonderful and very large state.
Absolutely large state. I've driven across it numerous times as a former denizen of Houston myself. And then you came up to the Boston area, settled in Hull for a while. Mm-hmm. Was there somebody that inspired you to do your research and to develop your show on the life and times of Joshua James?
Really, it came about because after I had moved to Hull, I wanted to get involved in the local theater scene, and I asked the local nonprofit, the Hull Performing Arts, if they needed me to write a musical, because I'd had a background in both music and in playwriting, and I decided for the first time to put them together. They suggested that I write a musical about the Weir River estuary, which is there in Hull. It was quite a challenge, but it turned out very well. And then following that production, everybody said, "Oh my gosh, you should write a musical about Joshua James," of whom I had never heard before. And it was very exciting to research his life, and it wound up being a tremendously successful production.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I want to get into the program, so I will move off screen and turn the program over to you, Cinzi, who's going to be talking about the musical Toilers of the Sea.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Fred. And considering that I've never commanded so much as a rowboat, I am very, very honored to be here this evening speaking with the Continental Commandery. It's very gracious of you to invite me, and I'm extremely proud to be here. I would also like to say to any Coast Guard service members who are with us this evening that I thank you very much for your service and hope that you'll especially enjoy tonight's production. We can probably begin with our first photo and dive right into Joshua James. He was born in 1826 in Hull, Massachusetts. The next photo here will show Hull. As you can see, it's a peninsula, and it is right before the entry to Boston Harbor. Unfortunately, it's also shipwreck central, or at least it was in those times. If you look to the right of that photo, you'll see that's the area through which the ships would pass from the right side to the left side, Boston Harbor being on the left of that picture. I think you can even see it in the distance. There are also some small islands around the tip of the peninsula, and Joshua James' home and life-saving station, where he spent his life working, were way, way out at the tip. On the next photo, we will see the area right there at the tip. That's between the end of the peninsula and one of the islands. The area is known as Hull Gut, and it features very prominently in Joshua James' life because it has extremely treacherous water currents. If you look at the photo carefully, you may even be able to see them. When you're standing there in person, you can see the different currents going in multiple directions. And as I said, it was especially treacherous for anybody sailing through there. And unfortunately, at age 10, Joshua witnessed his mother and baby sister drowning in that very area because they were returning from Boston on a ship, which was dashed on the rocks, and it went up on its beam and then went under. And they were within in a cabin and were unable to escape in time. So that incident was what marked him for life as somebody who had committed himself to be a lifesaver, because he decided that he would do anything he could in the future to help anybody else to deliver them from that fate. You can switch to our next photo, which shows a surf boat. Those were typical of the time. At age 15, Joshua snuck onto what I believe was his first rescue. The group doing the rescuing at that time in Hull was known as the Massachusetts Humane Society. It later had a different name, but at that time, that's what it was called. And he did subsequently work on many rescue crews there in Hull. He was known as a very brave and really excellent rescuer. During that time, he also worked for his father, shipping paving stones to Boston. So he had plenty of experience on the sea. He was known to be an excellent astronomer. It was even said that he could follow a coastline as if it were speaking to him. In fact, one time he was on a ship when he was quite young, and the helmsman lost his bearings in bad weather and drifted off course. And so James was awakened and brought on deck and asked if he could determine their location. He merely looked into the sky and commented that they were 2 hours distance from Minot Light, which was a local lighthouse. They later on encountered that very lighthouse exactly an hour and 55 minutes later. So his accuracy was virtually unbelievable. He was also a very studious man, and he had his brother Samuel design a lifeboat that would not overturn in rough surf. I'm not sure if this photo actually is that boat, but it might be, or it looked similar to that. The boat that his brother Samuel designed was named the Nantasket after Nantasket Beach, which is the beach there at Hull. The boat was especially created to withstand the particularly rough seas off the coast of Hull, and became a very prominent feature in life-saving at that time. The next photo we have shows the life-saving station there in Hull. It was, after being known as the Massachusetts Humane Society, it was called the Point Allerton Life-Saving Station. And that is where Joshua James was appointed as the keeper of the station. That is him pictured on the right with the cap and the dark clothes. And one of his crewmen is on the other side of the boat. I believe that boat that they're standing in front of is the Nantasket. Might be, I'm not sure. But anyway, he was appointed keeper there in 1889. In the next photo, we see Joshua James' life-saving crew. His crew is actually what we would call today diverse and inclusive, because besides Anglo-Saxon gentlemen, he also had surfmen who were Austrian, Dutch, Italian, Jewish, and Portuguese. So he was very accepting of anybody who was brave enough to come and serve with him. His wife, Louisa Lucci, was also actually a notable lifesaver. And overall, James had concerned himself with the problems of rescuers perishing at sea. In his time as keeper there, he was able to determine that the very, very high number of casualties among rescuers was due to the fact that they needed more highly coordinated drills and more preparation for rescues. So that was another of his major contributions to what would someday be the Coast Guard. He really knew that people needed to not just go out there with the best of intentions or with great strength, but they needed to have very highly coordinated preparation going into such dangerous situations. The next photo actually shows an example of those dangerous situations. Those are men putting a surf boat out to sea. Unfortunately, shipwrecks don't generally happen on calm, still days. And it was not uncommon for crew members to have to go miles to the site of a shipwreck. So an extraordinary amount of strength was needed. And of course, these were tremendously dangerous rescues they were going on. The expression, which I believe is still used today by the Coast Guard, is "we have to go out. We don't have to come back." Nevertheless, during the hurricane of 1888, when the conditions of rescue were so extremely dangerous, he actually warned his crew that the chances were that they would never return, and he said that only volunteers would be accepted to go with him. Every single member of his crew joined him immediately. They were very devoted to him and so confident of his command that they trusted him with their lives. Now, the next photo shows another character who featured prominently in my musical. This was John Boyle O'Reilly. From a playwriting standpoint, it was a little bit difficult to have an entire drama solely about Joshua James because he was a very low-key individual. He didn't have much flourish about him. He was very straightforward, very solid. And those are amazing qualities in a ship captain, but they make for a little bit of dry material on the stage. And I was so lucky that his very best friend and neighbor happened to be this gentleman, John Boyle O'Reilly, who was an Irish poet and patriot. He was born and raised in Ireland. He was a member of a military organization there fighting British rule in his country, the Fenians, otherwise known as the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And he was captured and tried for treason and sentenced to a penal colony in Australia, Van Diemen's Land. But he escaped from there and later became editor and owner of Boston's Catholic newspaper, The Pilot, which is still in existence. He also became a very outspoken proponent for cultural and religious tolerance, and he reversed his former militaristic stance. So he and James became very, very great friends, and his personality was a perfect combination with James, so it made for some really, really lovely theater. Now, the next photo shows the Hull Public Library. That's what it is today, but back in John Boyle O'Reilly's time, that was actually his summer home there in Hull. The home of Joshua James is right across the street from it. And as I said, this building is now the Hull Public Library, and a really, really lovely building. The next photo shows a casket in a boat, and I can explain that. Joshua James did continue as the keeper at Point Allerton Lifesaving Station until very old age. At that time, the minimum age limit was 45 for a keeper, but it was actually waived by an act of Congress so that Captain James could keep his position. Apparently, he easily passed the physical test, which he was given at age 73 with as much vigor as his young crewmen, so they did let him stay on. And in 1902, when he was 75 years old, the entire crew, except for one of the Monomoy Point Lifesaving Station, died attempting the rescue of a barge that had been stranded on the shoals off of Monomoy Point. James was particularly devastated by this, and the incident was, again, a reminder to him of the need for preparation and training for surfmen. So 2 days later, at 7 a.m., he took his crew out for a drill, and upon arriving back at the shore afterwards, James got out of the lifeboat, looked out to the sea, and said, "The tide is ebbing." Those were his last words. He then collapsed and died. So Captain Joshua James was known to have participated in at least 20 major rescues, saving over 600 lives. He was the most highly decorated civilian life-saving crew commander in United States history and is renowned as the greatest lifesaver in the world. He was buried in Hull Cemetery in a boat into which his casket was placed, and that is the photo that you see before you with members of his crew. The final or next to final photo is the old life-saving station. This is the station where he dedicated his life to rescuing others, and it is still standing. And the photo after that is the station as we know it today. It is currently the Hull Life-Saving Museum, and visitors can go there and see the Nantasket, the surf boat that he used, and see the building where he spent his life. So the next section of my talk has to do with the process of creating the musical. The first stage of anything like that I undertake is what I laughingly call the R&D stage, the research and development. And especially in this case, since it was a biographical musical, there was quite a lot of research that I had to do. You really, when you do a musical like this, you invest a great deal of time in it, and you eat and breathe and sleep this character for months, almost a year, basically. And so I had to find something that I was very interested in. I had to be very interested in Joshua James, and it was not difficult, because reading his life and seeing everything he had done, it was really amazing to learn more about him. I usually begin with the outline. After that, I write the musical numbers, and then I write the script around that. During my research, I remember spending quite a bit of time at the Hull Life-Saving Museum that we saw in the last picture. And I spent a lot of time staring at photos of him just to see things that I might be able to pick up that would give me clues to his personality. I know that he tied his shoelaces very neatly. That told me a lot. He also wore an expression of confidence all the time. And I think that was pretty telling about the sort of person that he was. In my other research that I did, as far as literature about him, I found out that he played the clarinet with a very popular band in Boston at one point when he was a young man, and almost became a professional musician. But his love of the sea drew him back to Hull and working at the life-saving station. He also loved to play chess. But he had an extremely dramatic life between his mother dying in Hull Gut, his many rescues under amazingly difficult conditions, his last words, "The tide is ebbing." I really didn't have to do much of anything to make his life story good fodder for the stage, because it was really all there. All I did was pretty much put everything together in one place. I also had to feel my way a little bit, as I do whenever I'm working with a biographical story. I remember one of the things that I was concerned about was how I was going to have everybody in one place to be discussing things that wasn't the life-saving station. And so I reasoned, in those days, where else would people go? And I thought, well, there were no online chat rooms or anything, so maybe they would have gathered at a tavern. So I created a mythical tavern, using dramatic license, that they would be gathering at. And it was only after the show that I found out through the historic district that a home that's there, a private house, actually did used to be a tavern in those days, and that is likely where they spent their time. So that guess turned out to be very accurate. Also, the drilling. I was trying to figure out what Joshua James would have done. He's got all these men here. He's trying to prepare them for these dangerous rescues. And what's going to be going through his mind, especially with the knowledge that a lot of rescuers die needlessly because they forget very important elements of rescue. So I thought he's going to be asking them questions constantly. He's probably going to be saying, "What's this? What's that?" And you'll see a scene later on where he does that. And that featured in the musical. And it was only later on that I found out from a historian that was one of the things that he was known for by his crew members. He was constantly saying to them, "What's this? What's the first rule of rescue?" He was always drilling them. So that also turned out to be a lucky guess. But at this time, I'll let you hear a little bit of it since it's a musical. We do have a sound clip of the main theme of the musical. And so without further ado, I'll let you have a listen to that, or a verse of it. Go ahead. Oh, that gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the music, and I will talk a bit later about that song. One of the songs, though, that was kind of fun to write and has a sort of an inside musician's joke is Black the Waves, which you'll also hear later. Um, there are certain musicians who are very fluent in all of the musical keys. I don't happen to be one of them. I think and create in the key of C and then change things later if I have to. I believe I've been told Elton John is the same way. He does everything in the key of C. So when I was playing my music, a lot of the people in the cast who were also very musically inclined would make jokes about how everything was in the key of C. That was during my first musical. So during this musical, I decided as a joke to write a song using all of the black keys, which would make it not be in the key of C. And so the song Black the Waves, which you'll hear later, was actually written on all of the black keys on a piano. So that's a musician's insider joke, so you don't feel bad if you don't find it that funny. Uh, some of the music that I used for the show also I adapted. I generally don't do that. I write all of the songs, but in this case, more than any other musical, this show, I found some other music that I adapted because I really felt like it was much better than anything I could write. An example was, of course, the song that you just heard. That's actually a folk tune called I Will Set My Ship in Order. So I wrote the lyrics, but the music is a folk song. And the lyrics that I put with the clip that you just heard are push bravely, mates, be sure and steadfast. Look to our guiding star once more, and toil ye bravely on the sea, lads. The tide is ebbing from the shore. There was also a hymn that I adapted for the scene where Joshua James' mother's burial takes place, and that's a very old hymn called "The Spiritual Sailor." It's a beautiful piece, and I had the cast sing it a cappella without accompaniment, and it was a really, really lovely piece. Again, I couldn't have written anything better than that. It's a phenomenal hymn. And finally, for the love scene between Joshua James and his future wife, I used The Water is Wide, which is another folk song that you may know. So some of the songs were adapted, but the rest were original. And the curators at the Lifesaving Museum checked the script for historical accuracy, which is something I always do with all of my historically based dramas because I don't want to rewrite history. There's certain dramatic license that has to be taken. You have to imagine certain conversations based on facts that you know, but I really don't like to do any more than that. I really want to keep things as historically based as possible because really, honestly, most of the time the history is much more fascinating than anything I could create. Overall, in studying the life of Joshua James to prepare this musical, I was struck by the fact that he did not allow himself to be defined by his tragedies. And my takeaway from this was that his attitude was always to do what he could do rather than focusing on anything that he was not able to achieve. He did what he could. So that was a really, really big lesson, and it's one that I still carry with me. And with that, I can turn our attention over to our first script excerpt. So that'll be Fred and John. Well, I'm sorry, I'm supposed to do an introduction here, aren't I, for the what the scene is about while you guys are getting set. This is twilight at the Massachusetts Humane Society station at Point Allerton. Joshua James stands before the life-saving crew, and a photographer is present.
So I think we're having some difficulty listening to Fred as Joshua James. So I'm going to jump in and do both parts.
I'm back.
Oh,
I forgot to
okay.
myself. Sorry, everybody. My apologies. Okay, gentlemen, you're all good sailors or fishermen, strong swimmers, men of courage and compassion. But these attributes alone are not enough to make good lifesavers of you. How can your swimming ability help you if a victim in their panic clutches at you, causing you to both drown? How can your courage help you if your arms are weary from rowing to a shipwreck? How can your compassion help you if you have not the skill to keep a lifeboat from overturning in a stormy tide? The number of those who perish at sea, despite rescue attempts, is shockingly high. But even more shocking is the number of lifesavers who perish while trying to save them. This is indeed an unspeakable tragedy. Yes, our work must be done with courage and compassion, but also with skill and strength. Good organization is absolutely critical. We must engage in the practice drills so we can work as a team, knowing and trusting each other as though our very lives depend on it, for they do.
Captain James, may I take a photograph of you and your crew now?
Certainly.
I've been asked to come and get a photograph for the certificate that is being presented to you for the rescue of the officers and crew of the ship Delaware that was wrecked out on Toddy Rocks.
We did well that day, and with better training, we'll be prepared for anything that comes our way. You see, my crew and I, we have to go out. We don't have to come back.
Thank you so much for that reading. That brings me to the rehearsal and cast stories from the production of Toilers of the Sea, The Life of Joshua James. This show, after it had been created and named, was undertaken by the Hull Performing Arts, a local nonprofit, and we received a very generous grant from the Hull Cultural Council for funding. The biggest concern we had at the beginning was that we might not have enough men auditioning for the parts. It's sometimes the case that there are more women than men that audition for things. So especially considering that the cast of the show was almost entirely men, it was a concern, but we needn't have worried because we wound up having plenty of auditioners. I don't know if it was the idea of it being the story about Joshua James particularly, or because it was about, men doing life-saving and on the sea, but it was a big draw, and we were thrilled with the cast that we were able to assemble for this production. They were extraordinarily talented individuals. The elder Joshua James character, we had a younger and an elder because of the vastness of his life, the 75 years that had to be presented on stage. So we had a younger and an elder Joshua James cast in the roles. The elder was actually recovering from a major organ transplant, which we only found out after the production. So this gentleman gave 110%, especially at a time when it was probably most physically taxing for him. And I'm still blown away by his dedication to the production. The younger Joshua James was actually a singer from a very famous California rock band, and he had never done any singing that was not rock band singing. So I think he had some doubts about his ability to carry the role off, and he wound up just doing a spectacular job, encompassing the personality of the young Joshua James. So that was really fantastic. The actual age difference between the young Joshua James and the girl who played his wife was 16 years. And that was actually the age difference between the real Joshua James and his wife, Louisa Lucci. So that was a coincidence, but it was kind of interesting. The man who played John Boyle O'Reilly had no experience with him before the production, and he wound up doing a great deal of research. He's a very studious guy, and did a whole bunch of research and became so enamored of John Boyle O'Reilly, the person, that he wound up buying the house next door to the Hull Library so he could be near where John Boyle O'Reilly had spent his the remainder of his life. The house that he bought is actually one of the homes of one of Joshua James's daughters. So it was a James family house, and right next door to the home that had belonged to John Boyle O'Reilly. So that was a really neat situation. And then also the early rehearsals that we had were at the Hull Lifesaving Museum. So being there in the original building that was used where all the rescues took place was very fascinating. I mean, we were saturated with the atmosphere of being there. And I remember very pointedly that one night we were having a rehearsal. It was late, it was dark, it was a stormy evening, and there was we had a break or something, and I looked out the windows and looked into the sea right in front of the life-saving station in the area where Joshua James would have been launching a surf boat, and watching these tremendous waves crashing all over the place, and thinking to myself, the profound amount of courage and dedication that he and his crew must have had, and all lifesavers to go out into that. It was just really staggering. So that brought it very close to home to actually see that in person. The woman who wound up playing Joshua James' wife in the production was actually a real lifesaver and had been on many life-saving missions. And she had remarked that when they would go out to sea and it was rough like that, sometimes the oars of the rowboat would literally get torn from their grip and pulled out into the sea by the strength of the waves. And she said, it is terrifying. You're out there and you're just doing whatever you can. So I had a glimpse of what it must really be like to go out into that sort of situation to save other people's lives. And it was really remarkable. We had quite a few funny moments. I know during one of the early rehearsals with the woman who played Joshua James' mother, she was a woman from the Boston area, and she began singing the beginning of her song. And she sang, "There is a shipwreck in the harbor." And I thought, harbor? Harbor? It's not a harbor, it's harbor. I was the musical director for the production, and I was about to correct her and say, no, it's harbor, harbor, put the R in there. And then I thought to myself, wait a minute, Joshua James' mother was from the Boston area. So quite honestly, if she were singing a song, she probably would have said harbor. So I didn't correct it. I said, no, say harbor, say harbor. So we had quite a few funny moments. We had a good time with the production, and I really like all of my cast to enjoy what they're doing. Since I've been a professional musician, I've been in situations of employment where people expected you to be very rigid, and there was a feeling that if things were not perfect, they were going to chop your head off. And I never want anybody in my cast to feel like that. We're there to have a good time. It's not worth doing if we're not enjoying ourselves, because quite frankly, the audience can tell. So I got the guys to loosen up when they were doing the next song that you're about to hear. They were supposed to be singing in a bar room. The bar room that I didn't know existed until I think after the show had been produced. And they were all very excellent professionally trained singers, and they were being a little bit stiff. And I said, guys, pretend you're just there having a few beers and sing and have fun with it. And they wound up belting out, which you're about to hear now, which was great. So without further ado, here's the song "Oh Nantasket."
So it's here, I'll stay in that Nantasket, to you I'll be true. I swear, as sure as the tide, I'll never return home to you. I'll ride away to the ocean and sail on back into the bay, till my boat turns into my casket. Nantasket is where I will stay.
To another, and they had to do a complete costume change. And that was something that we hadn't noticed before. So we realized we needed to buy ourselves some time for that to happen. And here it is late at night, the night before opening night. So what we wound up doing was, I said, well, let me think. we've got to find some way to build time in here. And one of the actors was on the ball enough to say, well, look, I'm going to be coming out and moving some scenery in between those two scenes. If you can write something for me to maybe sing, I can kind of drag that out. I thought, oh, that's wonderful, brilliant idea. So I was really grateful he recommended that. So before I had left the rehearsal hall, I already had a tune in mind. And I remember by the time I got my key in the door of my apartment, I already had most of the lyrics written. So, ran in the door, sat down, typed them out, sent them to the actor, then called him up on the phone and sang the song to him. He learned it overnight. And it actually wound up being one of the favorite songs in the show, considering it had been written in about 8 minutes. I thought that was pretty ironic. But it was a very little piece. But at the time I wrote it, I was feeling kind of sad and nostalgic because it was the end of the rehearsal process. And so I probably put a lot of feeling into it, and it showed through. So it was a great success, and it did buy our actors enough time to change their costumes before the next scene. At this point, we should probably go ahead with our second excerpt from the script. This is going to be a scene between Joshua James and Francis Mitchell, who was his grandnephew, and also one of his surfmen. So the introduction for this reads, one stormy evening at the Massachusetts Humane Society station at Point Allerton, Francis Mitchell and the rest of the life-saving crew are present. Joshua James enters.
Good evening, Captain.
Unfortunately, it's not a good evening. I've received confirmation that a schooner, the Helene, is wrecked on Point Allerton Bar. Her captain and crew must be saved. This is your first rescue, gentlemen. And before anyone gets into that surf boat, we're going to remind ourselves of some very important facts. Mr. Mitchell, who constitute the majority of drowned victims?
Those who cannot swim and are in a panic, Captain.
Correct. And who constitute the second largest number of drowned victims?
Those trying to rescue those who cannot swim and are in a panic, Captain.
Correct again. And what is the first rule of rescue?
Never to put oneself in danger when rescuing someone else.
Correct. You cannot rescue anyone if you're dead. It is astounding how often we are apt to forget that. And what is the second rule of rescue?
You cannot kill the dead.
Correct. If a victim's situation is clearly hopeless, any rescue attempts whatsoever are encouraged, since the victim will surely die in the absence of intervention. All right, then, time for us to intervene. Let's get the surf boat into the water.
Captain, you'll never get that boat into that tide. The surf is pounding the shore. It's impossible.
We don't know that, Mr. Mitchell.
Then how do we know if it's impossible, Captain?
We know that it's impossible when we know that it's impossible.
What?
We will not desist from our efforts until their impossibility has been demonstrated by actual trial. We must attempt to launch our boat and fail before we know it to be impossible. Believing that the sea or surf is too heavy to make the rescue is an unacceptable excuse. Remember, Mr. Mitchell, lives are at stake. If they were our loved ones, wouldn't you attempt even the impossible to save them?
Yes, Captain.
So then into the sea.
Thank you very much. And the next segment of my talk, I'll briefly cover some production stories. I have a photo coming up here of Fort Revere. This is the actual site where we did the production. It debuted in 2010, and the house was packed. Now, if you'll take a quick look at the photo, kind of in the middle to the left, you'll see a building with a red roof. That is actually the Hull Life-Saving Station. And right over the wall there that you see, the back wall, is the Hull Cemetery where Joshua James is buried. So this was an absolutely ideal location for the production, except for one thing. We are also proximate to Boston's Logan Airport there. And depending on the weather, the flight patterns were sometimes coming directly over us. So our actors had to pause. It lasted for sometimes a minute. It was really disruptive. And I had to remind myself that in Shakespeare's time, he had to contend with orange wenches and other people selling goods in the midst of his productions out in the audience that he was competing with. So it was a difficult situation in some ways, but we made the best of it. The next photo here shows some of our actors. The gentleman that's, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 from the right is the one who played the elder Joshua James and did a terrific job. Now, we did have a surprise in the show that the audience didn't know about until the day came. We were extraordinarily honored to have Chief Warrant Officer Thomas Guthline, the ancient keeper of the Coast Guard, have a cameo role in the production. The ancient keeper of the Coast Guard is a singular position of the highest prestige that's passed down through the years in memory of James. And you can see Chief Warrant Officer Guthline in the next photo here. Now, there's quite a few fellows, but he is the one to the far left. So there he is. I didn't actually have any really good pictures of him from the production itself because one thing I'm not is a photographer. I wish I were, but there he is. And we were so thrilled to have him, and he did a really, really great job. And it was a very special, a special link to the past within the production that we were really grateful for. The next photo shows the actors playing Joshua James, and to the right is the young man who played Francis Mitchell. This was a scene where Joshua James is realizing that he's near the end of his career, and there's a sort of a passing of the torch from him to Francis Mitchell, who was his grandnephew. They'd grown very close over the years, and Mr. Mitchell was a very accomplished lifesaver. And so I imagined that one day they would have a conversation similar to this on a boat. In reality, Francis Mitchell did eventually succeed him in his role as the keeper of Point Allerton. But here is an excerpt from the script in which they have a conversation, and takes place late one night on a ship at sea off the Massachusetts coast. Joshua James and Francis Mitchell stand on deck.
That roll under the sea, fearing not but God, O Lord, that we could be just as brave as the waves that bow to thee. With a faith as deep as the black waves of the sea.
That was actually the song that comes after the scene, but we'll do the scene as well. That's the one I was telling you about that was all written on black keys. And here's their conversation. This is, again, late one night on a ship at sea off the Massachusetts coast. Joshua James and Francis Mitchell standing on deck.
I still remember the rescue of the Helene like it was yesterday.
Yes, the Helene. You young surfmen did admirable work on your first rescue, and thank God we were able to save everyone aboard.
That reminds me, there's something I've been meaning to ask you, Captain. I've been doing this for 15 years now, and I still find it grieves me deeply when victims are lost.
Francis, I've been doing this for 45 years, and it still grieves me deeply when victims are lost. I count it a blessing that such compassion never fades.
But at times, I find myself so remorseful.
You needn't be. We do what we can do. Besides having courage, a lifesaver must have faith, a faith that we are not masters of the universe, but merely servants, toilers of the sea, and all that will come to pass as it should.
But to think of those I've watched perish at sea, who even knows where their poor bodies have gone?
Francis, when I was a lad, my father bid me read the Bible. You know, I am not one for religion, but I believe that there is a God who cares for us and blesses us in our endeavors, who suffers with us in our misfortunes and strengthens us in our trials. In the verses I read, it promised that one day in a new world, the sea shall give up her dead, and I believe that.
That is a great hope.
Those who slip beneath the waves are not lost, only sleeping.
How vast the sea is.
They that go down to the sea in ships and occupy their business in great waters, these men see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep.
It's amazing tonight. It's so calm. The ship rocks like a cradle, and the water looks like molten silver in the moonlight. It makes one forget the rage and fury the sea is capable of.
There are black waves that roll under the sea beyond our sight, the heartbeat of the ocean.
Thank you again for the reading. That really was meant to be the symbolic transfer between Joshua James and young Francis Mitchell. And they had a really wonderful relationship. And as I said, Francis Mitchell wound up succeeding him as the keeper at Point Allerton. Now, as for the legacy of this production, it received mention in the Boston Globe, the online version anyway. That was nice. And apparently Onan Taskett became a popular drinking song in the bars of Hull. So maybe if you go there sometime, you'll hear it. The script has become part of the permanent collection of the Joshua James exhibit at the Coast Guard Heritage Museum in Barnstable, Massachusetts. And there is also a copy at the Hull Lifesaving Museum on display. And if anyone with deep pockets would like to finance this production again, Joshua James can certainly be brought to life. This is a production that, of course, could be done again any other time. So there's something to think about for the future. The best way I can wrap up my talk is to actually read to you the dedication. And this was read at the very end of the production. The character who plays Joshua James came out before the audience and said, "This musical is gratefully dedicated to the men and women of the United States Coast Guard, Reserve, and Auxiliary who risk their lives to save others." And with that, I'd like to cue the finale. So I guess that brings us to question and answer.
Absolutely does. I just like one. It was wonderful and enjoyed getting to play the role. My mother-in-law, who is an Obie award-winning actor, gives me grief for my lack of any acting skill whatsoever. But
You do a wonderful job.
when we talked about Hull and the Tasket, I took a look at the chart of Boston Harbor again. It's been over 40 years since I last plowed those waters. And one of the things I noticed is that really there's nothing east of that beach till you get to Europe. So you've got a tremendous fetch. And for those familiar with the area, we're on the North Atlantic continental shelf, which means the water almost 100 miles out is quite shallow. So as the Gulf Stream comes north and comes off of Cape Cod, gets pushed east, you really build up the waves, feel the bottom, and I can imagine just how tremendous the waves hitting that beach might be. Not quite like the Pacific coast, but it must be a great place to surf. And so let's see, I'm looking for questions from listeners. One was, you said it took about a year to put this together. Tell me a little bit about, community theater in Hull. Is it a decent troupe of folks that put on productions throughout the year, or were these folks that I know you talked a little bit about the tryouts, but how large a group is it, and how often do they put on productions?
I believe the cast for this musical was somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 people. They do productions, I think, at least once a year. I haven't been there in a while, but I think they do them about once a year at this point. Various productions. Often they have children's shows that give an opportunity for young people in the community to get involved and learn theater, which is also a really great socializing tool. You have older and younger kids getting along together, and they learn how to work. They learn team camaraderie. Counting on each other is a great thing. But the Hull Performing Arts has a long history in the town. I don't actually remember how long they've been there, but they would usually do about one production a year at least.
Very interesting. And do you keep in touch with them now that you've moved into the deep south of Western Connecticut?
Not really. It's been a lot of years.
So when did you actually present this for the first time?
This was presented in 2010 at Fort Revere Amphitheater. So it's been, about 13 years now. So,
Right.
Well, I have a note here from question. Did you have an opportunity to get reactions from the audience? Is that for me?
Yes, that's for you.
Oh, for me. After the show, people did come up. A lot of people, of course, expressed that they really enjoyed it. I honestly was most impressed by the members of the Coast Guard who came. Some of them said that they were, in tears watching this, which was a huge compliment, because another huge compliment I got from Coast Guard members was that they felt that the musical did capture what it was like to go on rescues. And I couldn't imagine greater praise than that, because that's absolutely what I was going for. And to have people who do that say that it reflected accurately was amazing.
It's been 12 years since the production, and probably a number of the people are not any longer available. When we discussed the play earlier this week, you mentioned that although you did a recording, as the wind blows outdoors in the amphitheater, the recording was not everything one would have hoped to have been. So for those companions that are watching this evening and expected to watch the musical from beginning to end, one, it's almost 2.5 hours long. Two, if we were to have played the recording, you would have heard mostly the sounds of wind blowing across the microphone. So our apologies. There are a couple of other excerpts on your website, if I recall. Go ahead.
Actually, oh no, I was going to say, I don't know if those are available yet, but I used to have a local cable access show in Hull called the Cinzi Lavin Show, and there is a Toilers of the Sea episode, which is the one that has some excerpts from the show that were done in the studio, so they had better sound quality. So if you want to see little bits of the show, that would be a way to take a look at that.
Everybody wait another week or so till Cinzi fixes some of the links on her website. I tried to go to Toilers of the Sea and the link was not working, so please fix that. I'd love to hear more. We're running up to the top of the hour, so I want to take this opportunity again to thank you for a fascinating insight into not only the life of Joshua James, but the creation of a piece of musical theater. I was remiss. I said I wasn't going to give your whole biography, but those of you who have been religiously reading your Naval Order newsletters know that twice this year, Cinzi has been recognized for her superb work. And other thing I neglected to mention, that she has been elected as a fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts. I presume that's the United Kingdom's Royal Society of the Arts?
Yes, it is.
As opposed to Belgium's or some other countries. But yes, the United Kingdom's Royal Society of Arts. So well done on that.
Thank you.
As we come to the top of the hour, we haven't quite finalized our March program, but as a teaser, we are confident it will be another Coast Guard related program where we hope to go to sea with our Vice Commander of Membership, Lieutenant Will Singletary. And we're looking forward to him providing us with a virtual tour of his cutter, the cutter Nashon, which is home ported out of balmy Homer, Alaska, just about as far away as you can get from the Boston Harbor area as one can still be in the continental United States. With that, I want to thank everybody and look forward to seeing you all for our March program. Watch the LinkedIn site for announcements. And of course, I'll be sending out broadcast emails to let everybody know the time and the date. I wish you all a good evening.